Are human beings and their activities destroying the planet? What does science really say about the impact of human beings on the Earth's climate? Find out next on this edition of Life Matters. Brian Johnston is the Western Director of the National Right to Life Committee. He has served in many capacities while advocating for innocent lives, as California Commissioner on Aging, as Chairman of the California Pro-Life Council, on the board of the National Legal Center for the Medically Dependent and Disabled. And now here's our host, Brian Johnston.
Welcome back to Life Matters. We're your program on the right to life, that singular issue that's the foundation for our freedoms in this nation. All of our other rights, our rights to be secure in our person, papers, and property, our right to free speech, our right to keep and bear arms, that emanates from the fact that we as human beings are extraordinary. We're given a gift by our Creator, said our founders. And our founding fathers said that the government, its first duty is to protect the lives, the right to life of the innocent. It's a foundational premise for all societies. Every society has needed someone to enforce what's just and unjust, to protect the innocent from those that might take their lives. That's why we have policemen with guns and badges. The right to life is an essential premise, but that idea is under attack right now. And there's a battle of ideas raging right now over this right to life. Today we're going to talk about an issue we have spoken of before. It's an ongoing issue. It's a misrepresentation of all of our concerns. All of us, as human beings, are concerned about our planet. We don't want it dirty. We don't want to drink dirty water. And you probably realize this, it's been Western civilization that has done more to ensure clean water and clean energy, that we have the blessings of the freedoms we've inherited. And part of that is our ability to manage and control our environment. But that's been misrepresented now. And there's an insidious premise in this battle of ideas. When it comes to our care for the planet and nature, it's been inverted. And today we're going to hear from a man who is one of the founders of Greenpeace, Dr. Patrick Moore. And Dr. Patrick Moore is a scientist. He was one of the only scientists involved in the ecology movement at the time. And he was the only scientist actively involved at the founding of Greenpeace. You're going to hear from him. And we've talked about this before. We've talked about the radical environmental view that human beings are themselves bad, and that human beings are the enemy. And the fewer human beings there are, the better off the planet's going to be. This is an ideological construct that manifests itself in many policies, and you hear it in the overpopulation debate. You hear it in the debate to make sure that there's enough of us. We can limit, if there's fewer kids, if there's fewer older people to take care of, how much better that's going to be. This premise is insidious. In this battle of ideas, if you don't understand how it sneaks in, I'll be honest with you. What has alarmed me recently are many otherwise traditional religious leaders from whom you'd least expect it, that are now embracing the environmentalist predicate, the environmentalist principles, thinking that it's a nice thing, but in fact, the foundational premise undercuts the real responsibilities that we have as human beings, and more importantly, our responsibilities to other human beings. So this issue that undercuts the significance and value of human lives is an insidious enemy in the battle of ideas. And unless you can see through this fog of war, this fog of ideas, and cut through it, you too, and members of your church family, members of your own family, can be seduced by this thinking and can minimize the significance of where it leads and how it embraces actually a culture of death to human beings under false pretenses.
Life Matters continues after this.
They say sunlight is the best disinfectant. Did you know that California has a law on the books that says you need to protect babies born alive in the course of an abortion? But that law is simply ignored. The current legislature and Governor Newsom's administration support all abortions all the time, and they simply do not examine or regulate the practice even though our tax dollars pay for it. We need to shine a light on this cover-up of the abortion industry in our state. Go to californiaprolife.org and click on the Light of Day project. We need the facts about late-term abortion to be examined and made known. We need the government doing its job to protect lives. We need the light of day on this. Go to californiaprolife.org.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Welcome back to Life Matters, your program on the right to life, on the culture that emanates from that very important idea, because a whole culture has emanated from that, and we enjoy the riches of that culture. As I said, we've spoken of the danger of radical environmentalism other times on this program, and you can go back to the previous programs. If you remember years ago, the Unabomber was a radical environmentalist, Ted Kaczynski, and he planted a number of bombs on unsuspecting people who he saw to be destroying the environment. One was an acquaintance of mine. I didn't know him well, but I did know him from my work in Sacramento. His name was Gil Murray, a great guy, a father, and he was a forester. He worked for the California Forestry Association. And Ted Kaczynski thought that what he was doing was evil. Those of you familiar with the real impact on the environment of trees and forestry, if you really study science, you know that actually forestry is a wonderful thing and has wonderful benefits on the environment. People have inverted its meaning. You're going to hear some of that analysis in our upcoming comments from Dr. Patrick Moore. The fact is that real science shows that human beings have impacted the earth positively, and that our creative ability to care for the environment has brought great benefits to both the environment and to life on Earth. So, without further ado, we're going to hear from Dr. Patrick Moore, and I'll be back with comments later.
Why did I leave Greenpeace after 15 years? We started with a strong humanitarian perspective: save human civilization from all-out nuclear war. By the time I left, Greenpeace and much of the movement was depicting humans as the enemies of the Earth. I don't buy that. Also, the sharp end of the stick was the science. My fellow directors, none of whom had any formal science education, decided we should call chlorine the devil's element and ban it worldwide. My entreaties that chlorine was in fact the most important element for public health and medicine fell on deaf ears, part of the anti-human aspect. Science should be the basis for environmental policy, not sensationalism, misinformation, and fear. Here, Greenpeace in the Philippines portraying golden rice with the skull and crossbones, when in fact it could save 2 million children from death each year. Many opinions about climate change. 31,000 US scientists and professionals have signed this petition saying there is no evidence that we're going to cause catastrophic warming. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says it's extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. Let's just parse that for a sec. Extremely likely, is that a scientific term? And does it make it more likely to put the word extremely in front of it? The report before this, they had very likely. Now they've changed it to extremely likely, as if they're more certain. This is not a scientific term. It is a term of judgment. It is an opinion, in other words, when someone says something is likely. The dominant cause means somewhere between 50 and 100%. They don't have any idea, apparently, where it might be in that range. And since the mid-20th century means 1950, so they do not ascribe a major cause of warming before 1950 to human activity. The late Michael Crichton, I am certain there is too much certainty in the world, and I am certain that he is correct.
A common misrepresentation of the environmentalist movement is that somehow nuclear power is a terrible thing, and yet ironically it is one of the cleanest forms of energy and the most efficient, and as you'll hear from Dr. Moore, it's actually one of the safest forms of energy that we've yet developed.
If you look at all these campaigns, as I go through them, you will see that every one of them is based on something that is either invisible or so remote that no one of us could go and verify its truth with our own eyes. Now, the first principle of science, as in Galileo and Darwin and all the rest, is observation. seeing something or sensing something with a microscope or a Geiger counter or a telescope or another instrument along with it, which basically extends our senses out into the real world where we can observe things happening. And the second most important rule is replication, where if the same thing happens over and over again under similar or identical circumstances, you start to get a strong belief in the truth of this relationship between these things, cause and effect. So let's look at this. All nuclear plants should be shut down due to the dangers they pose. That is all surrounded around radiation, which is invisible and cannot be detected by the average person unless they own a Geiger counter. How many of you own a Geiger counter? One, right? And you're probably very much the exception in the general population. Nuclear reactors are the safest electricity technology in terms of fatalities per generated electricity that there is, much safer than hydroelectric. 90 people died in a hydroelectric accident in Russia not long ago. 250,000 people died in a hydroelectric dam breaching from an earthquake in China in 1975. So actually, hydroelectric is more dangerous than many of the other technologies, but nuclear is the safest.
Another falsehood that's being presented by environmentalists is that polar bears have reached extinction or near to it, and yet it's actually exactly the opposite. It's important to really study the science in what's objectively happening and not merely make certain assertions and leap to conclusions. Dr. Moore points out, again, he is an actual ecologist.
Polar bears are in danger of extinction. In 1970, there were about 6,000 polar bears. Today, there's 25,000 polar bears, and they still say they're in danger of extinction. A bunch of government-funded scientists go for a couple of weeks to the Arctic, look at some polar bears, find one that's dying of starvation, come back with the picture, get it in National Geographic, and apply for their next year's funding to go back again for 2 or 3 weeks. And this has been going on over and over and over again for years. Meanwhile, just recently, you may have read that the Nunavut government, along with agreement from the whole Circumpolar Conference of the Inuit, says there's too many polar bears because they're eating people. And the climate crazies say, oh, the only reason that's happening is because climate change is driving them into the villages because they're desperate for food. Well, one of the reasons they might be desperate for food is they're overpopulated. So there you go.
There is a tremendous push to move away from using plastics in any way, shape, and form. Here in California, they've actually banned the use of plastic straws. And yet the implications of this are great economically. And they're pushing us just as the use of plastic bags instead of paper bags became a whole bugaboo because no one knew how to use plastics or paper. And each was being condemned. The fact is that the premise of radical environmentalists is that whatever human beings do is to be questioned and is automatically wrong, because in their worldview, human beings are simply a problem, and yet it's human beings who are the solution.
There is a great plastic garbage patch the size of Texas in the Pacific. It does not exist. You can't see it because it's remote. But if you look at a real satellite photograph of the Pacific from space, you cannot see anything except the islands that are out there. The Hawaiian Islands are these teeny little dots. There is no Pacific garbage patch.
Comment quickly on birds, and in particular, how birds digest. I think it's important to realize that birds are scientifically quite different than us. And they have 2 stomachs. The first stomach is a gizzard. And here Dr. Moore is going to remind us, while people are complaining about the fact that seabirds will use plastics and actually give plastics to their young chicks, it's not nearly as severe as you might think. And in fact, in some ways, those plastics are just as efficient as other natural things they need for those gizzards. Here, Dr. Moore explains the real science of why those plastics are not actually harming those birds. And anyone familiar with birds? I'm very familiar. From a young age, we had pigeons and chickens and other animals. And you know, when you have to clean a bird and you have to open it up, you become a mini scientist as a child. And the gizzard is an amazing part of a bird's body, and it's how God designed them. Dr. Moore explains that.
Then they say, Albatross and other seabirds, these are remote things, not invisible. Albatross and other seabirds feed plastic to their chicks, mistaking it for food. And Attenborough goes along with that and weeps on the film in the new Blue Ocean, or whatever it's called, weeps openly to the camera. He knows full well, I think he wrote The Secret Life of Birds, he knows full well that the reason the mother albatross is feeding a piece of plastic to the chick is so it will go in its gizzard where it can, just like a pebble does in a land bird, grind the food that they can't eat, can't chew because they got no teeth. Birds have two stomachs, one gizzard and one stomach like ours. They normally pick up pieces of pumice from the sea, from the floating on the sea, because it's a rock from underwater volcanoes that floats because it's full of air. And so they use that a lot. But often there's not much pumice because there weren't many volcanoes. And so they resort to nuts and pieces of wood. Now they have bits of plastic. And they put them in the chick on purpose. Before the chick fledges, they put a big bunch of it in there to get that thing fat quick and digest its food faster, because the mother wants the chick to be able to feed itself. And so they load it up full of all this stuff to digest their food. And then before the chick flies, it barfs out what's called a bolus, B-O-L-U-S, which is a big wad of all this solid stuff it's had in its tummy while it's been in the nest. And for the rest of its life, it gathers its own stones, but there's of pumice, because there's no rocks in the ocean floating around like there are on the land for birds to swallow to grind their food. So that's what's going on.
One of the most frequent arguments about man-made global warming, again, that's the assertion. Mankind is bad. Mankind needs to be controlled by massive government programs that control what human beings do. And, as you know, in many countries, literally controlling the lives of human beings. In every Marxist socialist country, those lives have to be controlled by the government. And that's really the push that radical environmentalists want, is human lives controlled and, if need be, disposed of through the good graces of government. And yet, in fact, the reality is that the planet isn't warming, not in the way they're implying. And in fact, if it does, that's okay. It's actually warmed and cooled over the centuries. That climate comes and goes in a natural order. And I greatly appreciate how Dr. Moore addresses this issue when it comes to the coral reefs. Again, we're told the coral reefs are fading, and it's because of global warming, and it's irreplaceable, and something radical must be done by our governments. They must do it now. And yet, it's not real science. Dr. Moore comments on that.
The coral reefs are dying all around the world. They said in 2016, April, 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is dead, dying, or about to die, depending on which headline you read. There was a major bleaching event in the Great Barrier Reef. Almost all of it was confined to the northern third, where 97% of the reefs in the northern one-third had some bleaching, was the actual fact. That could have been 1% of each of those reefs, because 97% of them had some bleaching, but some could be anywhere from 1 to 50%. It was actually nowhere near 93% of anything, right? And then 2 years later, now, headlines are coming out saying coral reefs show incredible ability to recover from bleaching event, right? But it's not getting the worldwide coverage that the original bleaching event did. And also, the highest biodiversity of coral and reef fishes is in the warmest seas in the world, and they are not the Great Barrier Reef. They are the Coral Triangle. Indonesia, Polynesia, the Solomon Islands forms the triangle. I've been there snorkeling twice for 2-week expeditions. You would not believe it. Go there if you're a snorkeler, or if you want to learn to be one, go there. It's amazing, because the soft corals are there that undulate in the currents. And the fish are hundreds of species. This is the warmest oceans in the world. And the truth of the matter is, coral reefs have survived for 400 million years, during which time the Earth was much warmer than it is today, almost the entire period of time. So the thing about coral reefs dying is totally a crock.
Wow, that's Dr. Patrick Moore, one of the founders of Greenpeace. And I wish we had time for him to relay the frustration that he had and explaining to these ideologues. An ideologue is someone who's driven only by certain ideas and they're unwilling to examine them. And as a scientist, he was deeply, deeply hurt, particularly because these were people with whom he worked. But these were people who came to the conclusion that human beings are the enemy, that controlling human lives is the answer, that the earth is something that has to be protected at all costs, and they're exploiting an idea that you and I have and we share. We want everyone to have clean water. We want everyone to be safe. We want to take care of animals. But that doesn't mean that we now have to believe that animals are the same as a human being, that the life of a cow is the same as the life of a human being, that they should have all the protections that a human person has, especially the vulnerable human being. That's the reason we have laws, to protect the most vulnerable human beings in our midst. If we lose focus on what that is, then we lose focus on what really matters. So there's so many other aspects of Dr. Moore's story we don't have time to get into, but we'll talk more about this as an issue right after this.
You're listening to Life Matters.
Life Matters is sponsored by the California Pro-Life Council, the state affiliate of the National Right to Life Committee. To find out more on how you can help and be involved right where you are, go to californiaprolife.org. That's californiaprolife.org. We'll tell you how you can get involved in your local community, how you can be effective if you want to be a pro-life speaker. We have training programs and open doors of opportunity for you to speak on the life issue. If you'd like to donate your car or a boat, you can do that at californiaprolife.org. Car Easy makes it easy, and you find that on our website. We get the most of any donation program. Car Easy allows us to get the most out of your car. Maybe you're not getting the trade-in value you wanted. Maybe it's just not running the way it used to. Let your car be used for life. Go to californiaprolife.org and find out what you can do to make a difference. californiaprolife.org.
Be sure to subscribe to the Life Matters podcast with Brian Johnston. Go to lifematters.life to subscribe. And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
So we've been listening to Dr. Patrick Moore, who is involved at the founding of Greenpeace, who found that all of the environmentalists in that particular movement rejected science and committed themselves to ideology. We've reiterated the falsehoods that are being sold, not just by this movement, by the way. This has now gone into the public school system. And I have to be honest with you, it's gone into many parochial school systems. I don't care which particular school you're talking about. This has become a cultural battle of ideas. And unless you have clarity on what really is true, it's very easy to be lured into wrong conclusions. The reason ideas matter, as we say in Life Matters, ideas have consequences. But where they really matter is when they're enforced. And that's all a law is. A law is merely an idea that's enforced. And that's why you have to pay attention to ideas. That's why you have to dig down to what's really being said. And if someone is using language that's misleading, or coming to conclusions that they imply are scientifically accurate, and yet have no basis in science, as we just heard from Dr. Moore, you have to be willing to say, wait a second, is this a valid conclusion? Wait a minute. Should we adopt laws according to what these folks want to do? Right now, in every state in our nation at the federal level, the arguments for radical environmentalism have gained sway. And radical environmentalism dismisses the value of individual human lives. In fact, it does exactly the opposite. It sees human lives as disposable, and the sooner they're disposed of, the better. So they want to cull the population, if you will. We've talked about this before. If you listen to our podcast back in episode 97, we do talk at length about this same topic, environmental extremism. And in episode 67, we speak about the overpopulation myth with Dr. Stephen Mosher, a great man. I highly recommend that. Dr. Stephen Mosher is now the head of the Population Research Institute, and he goes through great detail to dispel the myth of overpopulation, which is often what undergirds people's acceptance of abortion and euthanasia, that, well, we're rid of a few more people. That can only help. You have to be willing to wade into this battle of ideas. And once you've considered and examined them and examined both sides and their implications, be able to help others come to sound conclusions. That's what we do here on Life Matters Radio. We dig into the specific issues of life. Why should human lives be protected? Why should we pursue just laws? Our founders asserted that if you're going to have a just government, you have to establish just laws. How can we figure out what's just and unjust? Take some time and consideration, but I assure you it's well worth the effort. And now we're going to talk about the implications of elections, because right now we're in the middle of a very fiery election. A lot of ideas are being thrown around, thick and fast and wild. And if you're not ready for them, it's easy to be manipulated by the popular media in particular, but also by the education system. And that's been my experience. A lot of the ideas that are actually told we have to understand and believe that are often presented in many classrooms, all the way down into grade school. A lot of these ideas are false. They're made to sound nice, but they're false. And so I want to encourage you to be involved in the battle of ideas, but in particular, since they're trying to put them into law, you need to pay attention to elections. If you go to the California Pro-Life website, californiaprolife.org, you can see our listing of pro-life candidates. You can also read lots of articles on why the pro-life issue is important. But go to californiaprolife.org, and you can find out who the local candidates are in your area. It's very important that you be involved in the battle of ideas. That's really what's at stake. Please take the extra effort. Find out who is on the side of life. I hope you understand it's very important. This battle for your culture isn't something far away. It's immediate, it's now, and you have a place in it. Thanks for listening.
If you have questions or comments for Life Matters, call 800-924-2490. Give us your name and the town you're calling from and a quick question or comment. Learn more about everything in today's show online at lifematters.life, where you'll find all the resources you need to protect life. Life Matters is a production of the California Pro-Life Council, the state affiliate of National Right to Life. Wherever you are in the nation, you can find out more at National Right to Life. You can find vital pro-life information and also find the access to your state and local Right to Life affiliate. Get informed and get involved.